Hi guys, welcome to Pathopulse_Radhika. So today we are going to see about the serology of hepatitis B. So this is important in pathology as well as in medicine. So before going into the serology, let me tell something about the hepatitis viruses. So there are a group of viruses which can cause hepatitis. So you have hepatitis A, hepatitis B and so on. So if you take these different viruses, so what is the difference between the different viruses? So you have A, B, D, E and so on. So except for hepatitis B, the rest are all RNA viruses, whereas hepatitis B is a double-stranded DNA virus. Okay. So remember, hepatitis B is a DNA virus, the rest all are RNA virus. So to understand the serology, you should know about the antigens present in the virus, because your body is going to produce antibody only against these antigens which are present in the hepatitis B virus. Okay, so now let's discuss this one. So just look at this image. So your hepatitis B has got different genes which code for different antigen. So you have the S gene which codes for the surface antigen. Then you have the C gene which codes for the core antigen and the precore antigen. Then you have something called the X gene which is going to code for HBX protein. Then you have the P gene which is going to code for the DNA polymerase. Okay, so let me repeat, they have different genes which code for different proteins. The S is going to code for the surface antigen, the S gene. Then your C gene is going to code for the core and the precore antigen. Your X gene is going to code for the HBX protein, whereas your P gene is going to code for your DNA polymerase. So DNA polymerase is an enzyme which has got reverse transcriptase activity because it's a DNA virus. So you have to remember, you have these these many antigens. So you have hepatitis B surface antigen, then you have hepatitis B core antigen, then you have the HBX protein, then you have the DNA polymerase. So when you take this core gene, it produces another protein as well, which we call it as the HBE antigen. Okay, so C is core antigen, E is a core, it's a protein with a core and a precore region. Okay, so these are the antigens which they produce, against which your body is going to produce antibodies. Now look at this image. You have the surface antigen, you have the core antigen, you have the E antigen, and you have your DNA polymerase in the nucleus, right? So your body is going to produce antigens. So after exposure to the antigens, your body will produce antibodies against these antigens. So the antibody against HBS antigen is called anti-HBS antibody. So likewise, we have antibodies for different antigens which are produced by the virus. So in general, what you should know is you have different types of antibodies as per the structure of the virus, and one more thing is you have different types of antibodies, immunoglobulins as well, like IgA, IgM, IgG and so on. So remember, IgM is produced immediately, that means quickly after exposure to antigen. So if you have IgM antibody, it indicates a acute etiology, acute onset. Whereas if you have IgG antibody, it indicates it's being present for quite long time. It indicates chronicity. So based on this, now let's move on to the serology. And this is a very important table. So having discussed about so many antigens, you must be familiar with everything. So you have HBS antigen, HBC core antigen, HBE antigen, and you have your DNA polymerase, and correspondingly you have anti-HBs antibody, then you have antibody against the core antigen. It could be IgM or IgG. So you have IgM anti-HBC, which is antibody against the core antigen. Then you have antibody against HBE, which is anti-HBE antibody. You can have antibody against your surface antigen, which could be IgG or IgM anti-HBs antibody. So corresponding to the antigen, you have antibody, right? So for surface antigen, you have IgM and IgG anti-HBs antibody. For hepatitis B core antigen, you have IgM and IgG anti-HBC antibody. And for the pre-core HBE protein, you have anti-HBE antibody, right? So likewise, you have different types of antibodies, okay? So don't get confused. So look at this. You have HBs antigen. Then they've given IgM and IgG anti-HBC. Then they've given anti-HBs. So what you should remember here is core antigen never appears in the blood. So when you're ordering for investigation, don't blindly write HBC antigen, because HBC, the core antigen, can never be detected in the blood. So make sure you take this point very carefully. HBC, your core antigen, is never ever going to appear in your blood, right? So this is very important. And now see, you imagine you have got infected by a hepatitis B virus. So the first thing it does is it will release the antigens. So first it is your surface antigen. So your surface antigen is released, right? So first thing is HBs antigen. Okay. So that's present in acute infection. So what did I tell? Core antigen never appears in the blood. Then you have HBE antigen. Okay. So the order of appearance of antigen and antibody is just the reverse. Your surface antigen appears first, then your pre-core antigen appears. But when you take the antibody, the first antibody to be formed is anti-HBC, which is of IgM type, right? Remember, core antigen doesn't appear, but core antibody will appear in your blood. Then it will be just the reverse. So your antibody against core antigen is formed. Then you have anti-HBE antibody. Then you have antibody against your surface antigen. So this is the order of appearance of your antibodies and the antigens. So first is surface antigen. You have core antigen, but it's not going to appear in your blood. Then you have the pre-core antigen. The antibody will be just the opposite. The first antibody to be formed is IgM anti-HBC. Then you have your anti-HBE antibody. Then you have your IgG anti-HBs antibody, right? So you should make that point very clear. Now let's go on to this table. Now if you have understood this concept, you can easily guess in what stage the patient is in. So let's imagine you have hepatitis B surface antigen and IgM anti-HBC. So it indicates acute infection. Why? Because on entering, your antigen is released and the first antibody to be formed is this antibody, and IgM is going to indicate your acute thing. If it was IgG, it's chronic. So this is the serology which you get to see in acute hepatitis B infection. But imagine even before acute infection, the patient will be in a window period. So what happens is, just before the onset of symptoms, you have one antibody appearing in the patient's blood. So that is IgM anti-HBC. So when you want to identify a patient in a window period, so this antibody can help. So if you want to identify a marker for window period, it's IgM anti-HBC antibody. That is antibody against the core antigen, which is of IgM type. Next, going to chronic infection. So you would have heard about the terminology chronic hepatitis. So when do you call chronic hepatitis? When the person is going to have surface antigen for a quite long time, like more than 6 months and so on. So you will have surface antigen. Because it's chronic, you have IgG antibodies as well. Okay. So you have IgE anti-HBC antibody and IgM anti-HBC antibody. Suppose you don't call it chronic. The patient had infection some time back, but he has recovered. That means we call it a prior infection. So what happens in prior infection? It's a chronic thing, but you don't have a surface antigen. So to call it as a chronic infection, you should have HBs antigen. But if it's a prior infection and the patient is recovered, what will be there? He had infection long time back, but you will have antibodies. So what's the antibody which indicates chronicity? Your IgG. So you have two types of IgG antibodies against your core antigen and your surface antigen. Suppose if you have only antibody against the surface antigen, what does it indicate? So we all must have received your hepatitis B vaccine. So hepatitis B vaccine is prepared from a surface antigen. So on injecting the surface antigen, your body will produce antibody against surface antigen. So if you have antibody against only the surface antigen, it indicates immunization. If it was infection, you will have antibody against core and pre-core antigen as well. So this is in short about the serology. So let me summarize again. So in acute infection, you will have surface antigen and IgM anti-HBC. So remember, core antigen never appears, but core antibody will be present in the blood. Then IgM anti-HBC is a marker of window period. So if you want to call it chronic hepatitis, you should have surface antigen as well as your antibodies. So you have surface antigen, your IgM may or may not be present, but you will have IgG antibody against the core antigen. But if you mean a prior infection, that means the patient is recovered, he is no more a carrier. So then they will have IgG antibody, and if you're immunized, you will have only antibody against your surface antigen. So I hope it's clear. So it's a very important topic and you should know how to interpret it. And the take home message is never order for a HBC antigen because you're not going to detect that in blood. And the marker of window period is IgM anti-HBC. And to call it chronic infection, you should have both the surface antigen and the antibodies, right? So thank you so much for your patient listening.